Michio, extra dimensions is front and center in the scientific world. No longer just science fiction. I want to understand how it works in string theory, in fundamental physics, and then potentially in cosmology in large extra dimensions. How significant is this in our understanding?
Let me tell you a story. When I was a child growing up in San Francisco area, I used to visit the Japanese tea garden and to visit the carp swimming just beneath the lily pads in a two-dimensional pond. I used to spend hours looking at them. They would swim forward, backward, left and right. Their eyes were to the side, and they couldn't see me. I was in the third dimension. I was in hyperspace. They were totally unaware that there was a universe beyond their pond. And then I thought, well, what happens if I reach down and grab one of the fish, lift the fish up? Maybe that fish was a scientist, and the scientist would say, bah, humbug, science fiction, there's no world of up. Up does not exist. Well, I would grab this scientist, lift them up in the world of up, hyperspace, the third dimension. What would he see? He would see beings breathing without water, a new law of biology. Beings moving without fins, a new law of physics. And then I would put the fish back into the pond. What kind of stories would he tell? Well, today, we physicists believe, we cannot prove it yet, but we are the fish. We spend all our life in three dimensions. We go forward, backward, left, right, up, down, thinking that anything beyond our pond, anything beyond our little puny universe is science fiction. We say, bah, humbug. We can't say that anymore because the concept of higher dimensions now is the biggest game in town. You see, in three dimensions, there's not enough room to put all the laws of physics. But when you go to this larger pond, this pond of hyperspace, then all the laws of physics just fit together like a jigsaw puzzle.
It looked like somebody was bent over and had their head in the window of the deer blind. It either heard me or smelt me, and he pulled his head out of the tent and stood straight up, and that shocked me. They don't make people that big.
The way it moved, almost as if it was gliding across the beach. I've never seen anything move like that in my life. They were screaming at each other in gibberish. It sounded like a language, and they were chuntering away back and forwards, back and forwards, back and forwards. I know what a bear looks like, and there is no way on this planet that what I saw were bears.
What are you reporting?
Jesus Christ, you better... Sheriff, Zia!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
This is Casey Shaw, and you're listening to Sasquatch Chronicles.
Welcome to the show, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. Got a great show planned for you. We're going to be chatting with Timothy Renner and Joshua Cutchins. They wrote a book, Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon. This is volume 2, The Evidence. What's fascinating about their book is they'll address a lot of the weird things that go on in some of these encounters. You know, some of the things that most people don't really want to talk about, even researchers don't want to talk about, that happen in a lot of Sasquatch encounters, and they address them, but they don't try and sell you on, well, it's this or it's that. They'll kind of go down the list of all the weird things, kind of give you a folklore history of things that have happened in the past that are very similar to this. And it's a very fascinating read. You can get it on Amazon. Again, the book is called Where the Footprints Ends, The High Strangeness of the Bigfoot Phenomena. So we'll be talking about some of the weird stuff tonight. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to be on the show, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. And if you get a chance, check out sasquatchchronicles.com. You can become a member and get additional shows. Let's jump into it tonight. I want to welcome Timothy Renner to the show. Tim, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Wes. Love Sasquatch Chronicles. Love being here. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate you being here, Tim. And everyone out there, definitely check out Tim's podcast, Strange Familiars. I throw it up on the blog every week at sasquatchchronicles.com. I listen every week. Love the show. I also want to welcome to the show Joshua Cutchins. Josh, thanks for coming on, man.
It's always great to talk to you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you being on, Josh. You know, before we get into your guys' book, because there's a lot of things I want to get into, you know, I've been reading a lot of quantum physics and dimensions and watching a lot of videos on it. And I came across this guy who he was explaining the different dimensions. And we know that there's actually 11, technically 12, but we'll say 11 dimensions that are actually there. And it's proven by math that they're there. And, you know, for me, my tiny mind trying to understand all of this, but he was explaining, you know, in the fourth dimension, how time and space wouldn't necessarily apply. In the fifth dimension, if you were able to go there, here's kind of what it would look like. Here's what you would experience, and how in the fourth dimension, objects are irrelevant. Time and space is kind of irrelevant. You could walk through walls. You could do different things. And it was really, really fascinating. One thing he said that really caught my attention, and I'm really curious on your guys' opinion on it, is he was talking about when you come back from, let's say you went from the fourth or fifth dimension. I think Albert Einstein said there was 11 dimensions. But if you, let's say you're in the fourth dimension and you were able to transition back to the third dimension, which is where we're at, there would be a residue. There would be almost like a smell. And this guy isn't into cryptids. He isn't into aliens. That's not where he was going with any of this. Basically, what he was saying was there would be a residue. There would be some sort of, and it would almost appear in the form of a smell coming from the fourth dimension to the third dimension, to our reality. And I really thought that was fascinating. You know, when you talk about these different cryptids or demonic encounters or alien encounters, generally there's always a smell associated with it. This real rotten, dirty, wet dog, feces type smell that people describe. It really caught my attention. I'm just kind of curious on what your guys' opinion on that is.
Yeah, I mean, well, smell is definitely Josh's department. He wrote a whole book on smells and the paranormal. But as far as like the hopping dimensions thing, you know, it's so hard to prove this stuff, right? Like, it's so hard. Like, who can prove it? But it's certainly, you know, it's a nice, clean explanation for this stuff that I like. But I certainly can't prove it. Yeah, that's super interesting. I'd actually never heard that coming from, you know, a higher dimension into our dimension, you would leave a smell. That's very, very interesting. Josh, I'm sure you have plenty to say about that.
Yeah, I got into this a bit with my book, The Brimstone Deceit, which looked at a lot of different smells throughout all the paranormal. And, far and away, the most common, I wouldn't say a majority of the smells that people notice in these supernatural, paranormal, cryptozoological encounters, but I would say a plurality, meaning like, you know, a solid like 40% or something like that, are sulfur compounds, or, you know, either hydrogen sulfide, which is the smell of rotten eggs, is probably the most common of that subset, or things like sulfur dioxide that are like the smell of a burning match. And I think that if memory serves, John Keel sort of thought that maybe some of these smells might indeed be the result of creatures hopping from dimension to dimension. And this idea, even though I didn't explore it in The Brimstone Deceit, was sort of addressed by our mutual friend, Soraya Azkath from Where Did the Road Go, that podcast, who thought that maybe the reason that you smell these foul smells, these smells of, you know, decay and entropy, because, you know, beyond that sulfur smell, a lot of these other smells are smells of decay, scatol and indole, all these things that are associated with decomposition, just like hydrogen sulfide is. Soraya suggested that perhaps what people are smelling is the smell of, entropy, the smell of decay, the idea that once some of these things come over into our dimension, they immediately start breaking down, and that's why you notice that smell. I don't know. It's an interesting line of speculation for sure.
Yeah, it just fascinated me. When I was watching this video, him talking about going from, and it was kind of fascinating. He's talking about because of math, these other dimensions. Albert Einstein talked about there being several different dimensions and kind of proving it through math. And then the smell really caught my attention, because in a lot of demonic encounters, they talk about the smell. And what's weird about the smell is it seems to be the same across the board. When you talk about UFOs or ghosts or Bigfoot or Dogman, it seems like everyone kind of describes that real terrible odor,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and there's a real problem too that people who study olfaction, who study smells, get into. It's called the tip of the nose phenomena, which is like the tip of the tongue phenomena, where you can't remember a word. But tip of the nose phenomena, where people actually have a really difficult time describing odors. So when you sort of start to look at this, you've got to say, well, what did this person mean by this or that or the other? But you're right. Generally speaking, the paranormal tends to stink, and you can sort of center a lot of them around sulfur compounds. I'm sure that, when people hear a name of a book like The Brimstone Deceit, they think I'm saying everything's demons, which is not what I say in the book, because it looks at a bunch of different smells. But there does seem to be a real sulfur/brimstone component to a lot of the stuff, and I'm not quite sure what to make of that. I had some ideas in the book, but they're nothing at all, concrete.
Yeah. What was kind of your theory on it, Josh? You said you had a couple ideas on it.
Well, to give away the thesis of the book, Wes, thanks. No, that's fine. It's a couple years old now. If you look at sort of the two categories that smells fall into, you kind of have these hydrogen sulfide, these sulfur smells rather. Predominantly, most of which are hydrogen sulfide. And then you have several other types of smells that are all trigeminal stimulants. And trigeminal stimulants are actually odors that stimulate your trigeminal nerve, which is the largest nerve in your face. It's the same mechanism by which smelling salts work. If you've ever smelled vinegar, you feel your face kind of tingle. That's your trigeminal nerve. And interestingly enough, there has been some research that's done that suggests that hydrogen sulfide, when carefully manipulated, actually can induce a state of suspended animation in mammals, in lab rats. So they're actually looking at this possibly as a means of helping people, if memory serves, in spaceflight to have some sort of state of suspended animation. So if you take a look at this, you've got one set of smells that tends to put people into an altered state of consciousness, or tends to knock them out. And you have another set of smells that tend to wake people up. So my idea was perhaps, depending on what people smell or what people remember smelling in these encounters, they either remember the smell just before they entered an altered state of consciousness, or they remember the smell that happens after they leave that altered state of consciousness. And again, people are going to hear me say altered state and say that I think that it's all in the mind. No, I don't think it's all in the mind. I think that a lot of the stuff interacts with us through the mind, but I think that these entities are themselves outside of us for sure.
I gotcha. Well, let's talk a little bit about the book, Where the Footprints Ends, High Strangeness, and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, Volume 2, The Evidence. Huge pain in the ass for the Bigfoot world, you guys writing this book, by the way.
That was my goal.
Yeah, and I liked the first one. I really liked the first one that you guys wrote, Where the Footprints Ends, Volume 1. Tim, tell us a little bit about this book. You and Josh you guys both wrote this book together like you guys did the first one, which was really cool because you kind of get you can almost kind of tell who's writing what based on a different perspective, but it all kind of blends together really well. This book, Volume 2, The Evidence, what kind of evidence do you have, and talk a little bit about why you and Josh went on with a second volume?
Sure. Well, mainly, it was because if we put it all together, the book would be so big that I think it would intimidate people. Honestly, I know when, doing my own podcast, when people send me their books and they're big, thick books, the first thing I think is, oh man, this is going to be a lot of reading. So honestly, it was, splitting it up for that factor. The other factor was Josh was way far ahead of me because he doesn't have a podcast in writing, and I had to catch up. So
excuses, yeah.
Splitting into 2 volumes allowed me to catch up a little bit. But we did have some reason for Volume 1 being folklore, Volume 2 evidence, and we'd like to say there's plenty of folklore in Volume 2, there's plenty of evidence in Volume 1. But in general, Volume 2 is more experiential, and it looks at things like the trackways and the footprints and the stick signs or stick symbols, hoaxes and disappearing evidence.
Yeah, these problematic footprints that are either, missing toes or have too many toes, or it's one single footprint all alone, or it's all of the left foot or all of the right foot, or these disappearing trackways, which is where the series gets its name from. But yeah, I think that Volume 2, and we didn't really even plan to do like a folklore volume and an evidence volume. We knew that we wanted to split it up like Tim alluded to, but we just sort of said, well, these kind of fit together into these two sort of categories. We didn't even realize it at the time. And that's sort of how we wound up with this little demarcation here.
Yeah, let me ask you, Josh. I know in the book you guys go into trackways and three-toed tracks. And, I get reports of these three-toed tracks. And I've actually seen a three-toed track in person. And it's weird. It reminded me of, I guess if you took like a chicken but made the foot as big as my foot or bigger and then, stomped it down in the mud, that's kind of what it looked like. Can you talk a little bit about what's in the book regarding the three-toed track and what's your take on it?
Well, yeah, I think you really sort of hit the nail on the head with that description, because the people who want to say that these tracks are because of some sort of inbreeding or some sort of injury, I don't think that they're really paying attention to what the data set is saying. We would assume that inbreeding would mean that these tracks are really isolated to a specific area. As a lot of people have said, oh, they're mostly in Pennsylvania. Well, that's not entirely true. There are three-toed tracks all across the country. And, moreover, if you do have some sort of deformity like syndactyly, which would be where you'd have toes fused together, it wouldn't manifest equally, the same on both feet. And then to say nothing of the fact that, like you said, these do not look like, regular hominid tracks that have had toes fused together. They just don't. They look like chicken's feet or something. And I know that, I'm a native of North Carolina, so I'm sort of fond of the flap that happened around the Cape Fear River in 1976. There was this Bigfoot in Chatham County, North Carolina, that was seen, a bunch of different places, and it was about 7 feet tall and would scream, and it was all hairy and was running around with this sort of slumping gait, but it would leave behind these, these tridactyl, these three-toed tracks, each measuring about 18 inches. And what's interesting to me is that, here we are talking about folklore already in the evidence volume, but I've got to throw this in there. There is no shortage of entities that are described both in Europe and in the New World amongst the indigenous peoples here that are like these monkeys with chicken feet or these monkeys with goose's feet. For example, in County Tipperary in Ireland, there was a fairy queen who wanted to run off someone who was sort of had set up his home on her property, and one of the guises that she took was a large ape with turkey's feet. So you've got that sort of three-toed motif happening right there. So anyway, I just think that the explanation that we're seeing some sort of, ape deformed foot just doesn't make sense. And then you'll find some people who say, oh, well, these are alligator tracks where the alligators have slid through the mud. But some of these tracks take place in areas where it would be just as anomalous to have an alligator as it would be to have a Bigfoot,
Yeah, and we were talking right before we hit record. I was telling you guys about the jinn. I've been kind of reading up on the jinn and how the jinn is just where the term genie comes from in our culture. In the Islamic culture, the jinn are very different. And it's fascinating when you read about them because they don't sound like a demon and they don't really sound like a ghost. They can appear, they can eat, they can poop, and then they're gone. You brought up a point, Josh, about the feet. We're talking about three-toed tracks. I don't know if this is applicable or not. Would you discuss a little bit about the jinn and how they don't really transform into fully into one particular, I don't know what I'm trying to say, creature?
No, that's well put, actually. A lot of my interest with the jinn sort of is a natural spinoff because I'm really interested and invested in fairy lore and how that resonates with a lot of these other paranormal encounters. And you can sort of find a rough analog between the jinn and the fairies. They're not exactly the same. There seems to be a little bit more of, a mortal component to the jinn for sure. But it was often said that whenever, even when they would appear in human form, the jinn were said to have some sort of physical flaw that would sort of expose what they really were. And sometimes they would have, hairy legs or hooved feet or something. But it's interesting when you look at some of the work from this. There's this great book by Ann Slayton Alberry called Bigfoot. That's sort of like the what would you say, Tim? Like the grandfather of where the footprints end?
I always call it the grandfather of where the footprints end. Yeah.
And they had shown a Dr. Roth of the Baltimore Zoo these three-toed footprints, and he said that it almost looked as when the Sasquatch construct and deconstruct themselves, the ones that leave behind the three-toed feet, they forget to put on the rest of the toes. And that's a nice little parallel to sort of that bit of jinn folklore about some part of their body always being malformed. It's interesting. I know that both Gordon Crichton, who was editor of the Flying Saucer Review, and the late Rosemary Ellen Guiley got a lot of mileage out of proposing that the jinn might be responsible for a lot of different paranormal phenomena.
Yeah, it is very interesting, especially when you really read up on the jinn, how they can shapeshift, how they can... It doesn't hit me as being like demonic, it does hit me as being demonic, but what's weird about it is they can be very physical. And I've had a lot of eyewitnesses on, veterans returning from Iraq, that had a lot of really bizarre encounters with what they thought were people. And then they would go talk to the locals and they would be like, no, that's a jinn. Tim, let me ask you about the trackways. I know there's a section in there, you guys deal with the trackways and how the footprints ends. And it is bizarre. I used to pass that off in the beginning going, well, maybe it jumped off somewhere. And I remember a guy sent me a picture of, and it was a trackway, and there was nowhere for this thing to jump off to, and the trackway just ended. And I had no explanation for it. And I know in the books you talk about the 1960s and 70s, how in California there was a tall, hairy creature they dubbed Big Ben. But tell me about the trackway section in the book.
Well, this is, one of the hearts of the research, I think, as we were going into this, because, as you know, and probably a lot of your listeners know, footprints remain the best evidence we have for Bigfoot. And we've got some wonderful casts that show, dermal ridges and mid-tarsal breaks and these wonderful aspects of anatomy that people like, Dr. Jeff Meldrum are complete experts on. And they can look at that and they can say, yeah, that's, you'd have to be another expert to fake that. And it's just, you just can't imagine that happening, like someone with that sort of expertise being out there and hoaxing all these tracks all over the country. So on one hand, you have it as our best evidence. You have these wonderful, wonderful tracks. And on the other, you have these disappearing trackways, these trackways that will just end in the middle of fields. I know even locally, I've talked to a few people, and the one guy was very much in the flesh and blood camp. And he told me, he was an older fellow, and he told me straight to my face, he's like, oh yeah, these things turn around and walk backwards in their own tracks, which sounds interesting. And that's the explanation that I think I was told when I first got into Bigfoot. I started at the logical place where I think everybody starts, where it's some kind of, animal, some kind of creature or relic hominid that's out there, something we'll be able to catch someday. And that's the explanation I was given. And I kind of took it at face value. But if you really, really think about that, if you think about, an 800,000-pound creature tiptoeing backwards through its own tracks, just so humans won't track it? But, it's bizarre. And if you ever try to walk backwards in your own tracks, try it sometime. See if you don't mess them up. You'll mess them up real bad. So on one hand, you have these great casts, these great, wonderful evidence, like I said, probably the best evidence we have. And on the other, you have all these mysteries surrounding these trackways that just end, or like Josh said, these 2 or 3 tracks that just appear in the middle of like an acre. I think they were talking about, in the Ape Canyon case, they were talking about, I think it was 2 or 3 footprints in the middle of a 2-acre wide sandbar, perfectly soft mud. They could not figure out. They said it looked like something picked up whatever it was that made the footprints and dropped them down in the middle of the sandbar and picked them up again. So it's very problematic, and it's almost as if the the phenomena itself is self-negating in a way, and I know that sounds really bizarre, and it gets into stuff like hoaxing and the trickster, which we go into as well. But we never seem to get the full story with this stuff.
If I could interject too, I'm very sympathetic to these ideas that Bigfoot jumps to another piece of media that isn't as likely to transfer their footprints. So like Bigfoot jumps to a rock or Bigfoot jumps to a tree or something. I get those arguments because, there's a wide amount of sightings that talk about Bigfoot having these, incredible leaps. But, the animals that have the largest leaps in the animal kingdom are a small African antelope called the klipspringer and the snow leopard. And they tend to max out at like a 25-foot vertical leap or a 50-foot horizontal leap. And, some of these trackways end in the middle of, in the middle of a field with 100 yards of barren snow with nothing else around it, or mud or something. So it doesn't, that explanation might account for some of these ending trackways, but certainly not all of them.
Yeah, it's very strange. As I talk to eyewitnesses, one of the things that comes up a lot is pacing. And I don't know if you guys get into it, or I haven't gotten to that point in the book, but where they pace eyewitnesses. And the eyewitnesses will say, when I stopped, it stopped. And when I moved, it moved. And it was pacing step for step, but it was just outside of my light. I just couldn't see where, and I shined the light over there. It should have been there, but it wasn't there. I hear that time and time again. Or you hear them where they stay just outside of the firelight, circling your camp. And when you guys really think about that, and I know it's going a little bit off of what we're talking about, when you really think about that, trying to pace someone in the woods when they're on a trail and you're off to the side and match them step for step, especially in the dark, let alone in the daytime, but especially in the dark, sounds impossible. But you hear it time and time again. What are your guys' thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, to me, yes, it's very, very difficult. But to me, the weirder thing about that is these people but very often can't see it, whatever it is. They can hear it. It sounds like it's right beside them, but they go to look and it's not there. They'll shine their lights over, or if it's during the day, they're looking, there's like, oh, it must have been just outside of where I could see it. But it certainly sounds like it's right close to them. In the winter, if you're in the woods, you've got a pretty good line of sight. You can see for a while. So to me, that's almost the weirder part of that. But I've heard this myself. I've been paced by something in the woods, and it seems like it's very on, and it almost seems like they use whatever noise is around, including insect noise, to disguise their movement somehow. Again, if this is a natural creature, it's the king of evolution. But you could stop, and then it seems like there's always like a shuffle or like one more footstep beyond that. So it really seems like something's there. Like it seems like something's naturally there. But how they accomplish this, I think, is down to how they accomplish these other things. How do they get on top of roofs and not damage them? How many reports have you taken of them getting on top of trailers, Wes?
A lot.
And, yeah. And there's somehow no damage from these things, which is just really bizarre,
Josh, let me ask you about vocalizations, and I just had David and Jeff on the show. The last show we were talking about vocalizations. Well, he was talking about pacing. It was pacing him out, and he thought it was his brother-in-law. And he would stop and he'd go, "David, is that you? David. And so he's calling out thinking it's David, and it's dark and he's trying to figure out what's pacing him. And it responds back with David in a real creepy, deep voice back to the witness. It says his name. He says the name of his brother-in-law, David. And he freaks out at that point. But, in a lot of these vocalizations, there's a lot of mimicking going on. And I know you guys have a section on vocalizations and mimic crying, or the mimic that people talk about. We talk a little bit about that, Josh, in the book. What can readers kind of expect in that section?
Well, I think that this again speaks to what Tim mentioned, the fact that if Bigfoot is a natural creature, it's the king of evolution, but it's also got to be the king of evolution in like 6 or 7 different areas, right? So not only, this uncanny ability to be a forest ninja, but also its ability to mimic. I mean, apes don't speak human words very well. There's the most notable exception was in 2015, someone taught a 50-year-old orangutan to sort of mimic vocal cadence and the pronunciation of some words, but there's nothing like what we hear coming out of, some of these Bigfoot accounts. Sometimes accounts that sound like Bigfoot knows what people are saying and responds. And sometimes just, straight up mimicry like you alluded to. And, this podcast was a great resource for that. The number of people who have said that they've heard, the sound of forklifts, the sound of trains, all these things that are reproduced to a really, really unsettling degree in terms of their accuracy. It would have to mimic something like the lyrebird of Australia, which if you've ever, anybody who hasn't looked it up, you really should look up the lyrebird, because the lyrebird can sound like a chainsaw. It can sound like, the shutter of a camera. It would have to be something along those lines. I know that Ron Moorhead has proposed that perhaps Bigfoot has, an extra set of vocal folds, but the only mammal that we know of that has an extra set of vocal folds is the koala. And it's useful in producing some, low frequencies, so that, it might help to explain some of these infrasound concepts that we talk about. But it does not mimic anything, the koala. But you'll hear these things of, every bird on the book, owls, people's voices. I mean, one of the things that I heard a long time ago was the story of, the fellows out in California who encountered the Zoobies, the story of the Zoobies. These cops who were talking to this guy who said that these things were on his property, and they would actually call in the chickens at night. They go, "Here, chicky, chicky," or that great story from Pike County, Georgia, about the dog named the Chihuahua named Peanut. That there would be a Bigfoot that would come to the trailer and knock and go, "Peanut, Peanut." An incredible level of intelligence, an incredible level of mimicry that you just don't see really anywhere else to that degree, especially among mammals. But, you do sort of see it in some of the magical traditions about, beings being shapeshifters, or some of these fairy folk calling people out to the woods, calling children's names in the woods and having them come out. It really does resonate with a lot of those ideas for sure. To say nothing of the samurai chatter, which is a whole other topic in and of itself.
Yeah, what's your take on the samurai chatter? I think my audience is pretty well aware of the samurai chatter from Ron Moorhead and the vocals that they do. Do you think that's like their own language that they're talking back and forth in, or what's your take on that? Because it's very different from the whoops, the howls, the roars, the very animalistic type sounds, and then you get the Sierra sound and the samurai chatter, and it sounds kind of human almost.
Well, and the thing about it too is that you read these accounts, and even though they might not always describe it the same way, you can just hear what people are saying, and like, oh yeah, that's exactly what they're describing. It sounded like people speaking Russian backwards, or it sounded like some sort of Asiatic language being spoken from the gut. Like, these all sound like they're describing the same thing. I do think that there's something to it in terms of perhaps being a language. I tend to have a little bit more esoteric, a little bit more interested in seeing how these things line up with magical practice and the occult. And we have a mutual friend, Tim and I, by the name of Ren Collier, who pointed out to me one time we were hanging out, and he said, "Hey, Josh, have you ever noticed that the Sierra sounds sound a lot like barbarous words?" And, while I do tend to lean towards like quote unquote natural.
They sound like what?
Sorry?
They sound like what?
Barbarous words. So I really wasn't familiar with this concept, but they're sort of a fake language that people use in magical rituals. A lot of the early grimoires, a lot of the early magical books would have, some sort of transliterated fake language that was like, supposedly it was Hebrew or some sort of ancient language, ancient Enochian or something. That was really nonsense words, but when you spoke them, they had their really guttural quality, and were all sort of mixed up, and they were not really meaningless in a strict sense. They had, they had intention behind them, but as far as being an actual language, they were not the same, even though they were based on some languages. So I see a little bit of a parallel to that for sure.
Almost like the occult version of speaking in tongues.
Oh, I get
yeah, that's actually a really good way to put it, Tim. Thank you. And then again, you look at the wild man tradition in Europe, and there's actually accounts where people supposedly had captured wild men, but they didn't. And it always says the wild men spoke words, but they were only murmuring. Their words didn't have actual literal meaning. You can find this in some of the European works of people like Edmund Spencer. He said that this wild man would just basically utter gibberish. There were words, but they didn't have any meaning. So I kind of wonder if that's describing a similar phenomena here in North America.
Yeah, and I want to ask you, Tim, and I want to get to the part where you guys talk about the songs, the singing, and I've had lots of eyewitnesses talk about the singing. But Tim, what's your take on the mimicking? I mean, when I hear a baby crying in the woods, or a child crying in the woods, or a woman that sounds like she's in a pain, I'm gonna go and try and help, and it kind of feels like a trap. What's your take on the mimicking that we hear that Sasquatch does?
It's hard to take it any other way than ominous, honestly, because what we hear about again and again on your show and my show and any number of witness accounts is these creatures either calling or beckoning to children. Like you said, the sound of crying babies, which is a very specific sound, and we as humans are programmed to want to stop that. That's why the sound of crying babies is particularly annoying to us. It's particularly upsetting because we're as humans we're sort of programmed to want to stop that. You want to comfort that baby. You want to find out what's wrong and make it better for him. The sound of like Josh said, of them learning pet names and calling people's pets. That's incredibly creepy considering the record Bigfoot has with dogs. It's not a great record. People. Your dogs won't last long around Bigfoot. I've often told people if people want to go Bigfooting on a regular basis and take their dog, I was like, man, be careful. Like you might not have your dog for long. There's really one out there because they just don't like dogs for whatever reason. So it's very ominous this idea that they're the way they're learning this mimicry and the way they use it. So it's hard to take that and spin it into a positive, really. At least for me, it is.
But we'd be remiss, too, if we didn't acknowledge the fact that John Keel claimed that the two most common, quote-unquote, auditory hallucinations, a controversial word, I wouldn't say hallucinations, but the two most common sounds that people noticed whenever they had encounters of the UFO or haunting or even indeed, he called them monsters, but, Bigfoot variety were the sound of a baby crying and a car door slamming. And of course, Ron Moorhead has talked about hearing a car door slam way out in the wilderness by the Sierra side as well.
I've heard the car door slam twice myself. I've recorded it once. I have it on a recording of it.
Tell us about that, Tim.
The first time I was on Toad Road, so the first time I was on your show, my first book I wrote about Toad Road, and this was at a later date. This was a couple years ago. I try to hike it once a year, and I was out there with a friend, and I heard a car door sound. It sounded like it was right in my right ear as we're walking down the trail. And I looked around for a four-wheel drive. I'm trying to think, how did somebody get a car out here? And that when I was like, wow, that was really weird. But maybe it's just the way sound carried up the creek or something. But the second time, when I actually got it recorded, I was on a Bigfoot investigation. Somebody had seen a creature by the river and had a like a Class B, like an auditory account. So he had two kind of encounters. And I went down there, and it was just about nightfall, and we were way out. My buddy and I were miles out into the woods because we found where we thought this guy was. The witness didn't accompany us; he gave me all the details, and then I kind of went out there. And we thought we found where he was, and we just decided to hike on back further into the forest there. And we were, like I said, we were miles out, at least 2 or 3 miles into the forest, into the woods there. And here's the sound of a car door right as it's getting dark. And I looked around everywhere. And in fact, on a later date, we came upon a hunter out there, and I asked him, because we went back, I asked him, where's the nearest parking area? And he's like, oh, it's way up, over this ridge, and it's long way away, miles probably from where we were, at least a mile. So I don't know what that could have been, but I got it on. I was running a recorder, and I got the sound on a recorder. So it's completely inexplicable. Sounds just like a car door slamming.
It's very strange. I know Ron Moorhead did talk about that. In his Sierra camp, there's nowhere, you can't drive a car up there. But he describes a lot of weird things, like their camp being torn apart one night and just being destroyed. And they come out of the shelter when it's all over with and nothing has been moved. Bizarre.
Yeah. They had weird lights up there. They had, at one point they said they could like rub their feet on the ground and make these lights come on, these weird lights. I mean, that's just completely bizarre. They had a light in the shelter one night. Al Berry, the guy who wrote that book Bigfoot with Ann Slate that Josh was talking about earlier, he was up there with Ron in the 70s, and he would experienced a lot of this stuff. I think Al Berry recorded some of the serious sounds that we're familiar with today. But yeah, there's just loads of really weird stuff went on up there, including like the sound of the what seems to be like that tube and throat singer sound that Josh talks about.
Yeah, and I want to get into that. There's a section with vocals, and then there's a section you guys talk about with, I believe it's singing, infrasound, and altered states of consciousness. I remember the first time, I think it was a lady in Canada that was talking about it, and she said it reminded her of like someone at an opera, but they would only do 2 or 3 different tones. And I had another guy who came on and he talked about it. And he said, you know what it reminded me of? And I said, what's that? He said, you ever heard the Gregorian chant? And I said, yeah I have. And he goes, it reminded me of the Gregorian chant. And it made me think, because I knew the Book of Enoch and the Gregorians were actually the watchers in the Book of Enoch. And it makes you wonder where the Gregorian chant actually comes from. But Josh, tell us a little bit about the singing section and the infrasound, and just the singing section. We can get to the infrasound.
Well, this might take a minute, but it really ties into what I was talking about earlier with my other book and this idea of altered states of consciousness playing a role. It's been noted in the UFO community for a long time that a lot of UFO encounters tend to mimic what people experience during psychedelic trips. And there is evidence to suggest that psychedelic trips are not just hallucinations, that they actually have some sort of basis in reality. And a lot of people in the UFO community, at least in the circles that I travel in, are sort of amenable to the idea that these altered states of consciousness we can all slip into because we're all carrying certain hallucinogenic compounds in our brains. That's the shortest way to put it. And that somehow there is some other intelligence that can activate those compounds and can actually communicate with us through that medium. And that's why you have a lot of these, high strangeness things. Well, obviously in Bigfoot, because that's the subtitle of these books, but also in these UFO accounts. So it occurred to me that this really hasn't been a lot of discussion of this as a possibility in the Bigfoot community. And I can certainly understand why. There aren't a ton of encounters where people report, taking mushrooms and seeing Bigfoot, although, you find a handful of them here and there. But there is an odd tendency for people to sometimes report a buzzing sound or a humming sound sometime in close proximity to their interaction. I know Brenton Selwyn noticed that. I think there's some folks actually on your forums that I looked at when I was writing this book that have reported similar things as well. And that does tie into this idea of singing, and I'll sort of get to that in a moment. You had mentioned that sort of opera comparison. That's exactly the same comparison that Doug Hajicek made at the Snellgrove Lake. Snellgrove Lake, right? Yeah. The Snellgrove Lake camp, he said he heard someone that sounded like they were, an opera singer warming up or something.
Yeah, let's have him on. I remember that show.
It might have been from that show that I got that citation. But you do hear these reports of people singing, and if it's something like Gregorian chant, that implies sort of a modal, melody that's being spoken. But there is a really compelling description of some sort of singing in that Berry and Slate book that talks about noticing this low droning sound that welled out of the gut with a bunch of ums and ahs and ohs. And Berry actually compared it to a style of singing that he heard in the 70s in a Japanese monastery. Now, if you look at some of the practicing people from the Ainu culture in Japan, they actually practiced overtone singing up until about, I think the last practitioner died in the late 70s, 76 or so. And overtone singing is what people call Tuvan throat singing, which is where you produce, I wish I could do it so I could demonstrate, but people produce, a fundamental pitch with their voice, and then they manipulate their vocal cords so that they're actually sounding a second pitch over it. And that is something that, seems to correspond directly to what Barry experienced, but also I recall that you had a witness on here who compared Bigfoot to making this sort of didgeridoo-like sound. And that's interesting, and that ties into the altered states conversation because drones, buzzes, and even specifically the didgeridoo are used by some people, by some cultures, Australian Aborigines in the case of the didgeridoo, to initiate these altered states of consciousness where they are able to contact the other world, to contact the spirit world. And to make matters even more compelling, that sort of Tuvan throat singing sound, which again, same concept as a didgeridoo, you have your fundamental pitch with another pitch sounding over it. That sort of Tuvan throat singing, overtone singing, almost didgeridoo-like sound has appeared in the background of one of Tim's on-site interviews that he did with the Bigfoot witness.
Really? I didn't know that, Tim.
Yeah. I captured about, maybe almost a minute of it, but we were talking the whole time, and we didn't hear it when we were there. And he had several encounters. It was actually somebody that was on one of your very earliest shows, Wes, but he was local to me, and he contacted me, and I met him on the site of his show. He'd been screamed at. I think that's the only thing he talked about on your show, and he'd had a couple other encounters since then. But he took me to this place. It was less than a mile, probably as the crow flies, away from his encounter. And he wanted to take me there because there's a legend of this ghostly woman in white around this pond. But I was interviewing him, and as I'm playing the interview back, I hear, now it was very cold when I was interviewing him, and I remember I didn't put my coat on. He was driving me to these different locations that day, and I left my coat in his truck, and I remember I just wanted to get the interview done. It was that cold. So I might have missed it on account of that, but I asked him, did you hear this? When I sent him the clip of it, he said, no, I didn't hear it either that day when we were there. So it's the whole time we're interviewing, you just hear this low kind of, I call it a groan almost, but it is constant, like a low droning vocal beneath us. And there's about, maybe a second or two where we're not talking, where you can hear, where I clipped it out and you can actually hear this sort of sound. And boy, it's there, whatever it was. But again, we did not hear it when we were there, doing the interview.
Tim, did you put that up on your podcast, Strange Familiars?
I did, and I'll drop you the clip of it in a bit.
Yeah, please do. Go ahead, Josh.
I was just going to say, to sort of further drive home this connection that might seem sort of spurious about, singing and buzzing and altered states of consciousness. I found a report from 1934 in Canada where this woman who was in British Columbia heard a buzzing sound. It sounded like a hummingbird really close to her as she's washing clothes in the river. And she turns around and there's a Bigfoot there. And she hides her eyes because she knows that this sound has something to do with the creature's ability to hypnotize people. 1976, somebody in Pierce County, Washington, is retrieving clay pigeons, and he sees this 8-foot Bigfoot stand up. He hears this buzzing sensation. He experiences time slowing down, tunnel vision, and paralysis as he's looking at it. And he's suddenly able to break this sort of curse. And I had alluded to Brenton Sallin experiencing this too. When this sound hit him, he was absolutely, or a witness that he was talking to in Oklahoma, the witness got hit with this and he was barely able to push through it. And there was this giant roar, but the person right beside him didn't hear or experience any of this stuff either. So there seems to be some sort of consciousness component at play with this. And when you fold in things like mindspeak that people talk about, which happen, I know, I'm a listener from the OG days, Wes. So yeah, we used to talk about flute players, and I used to kind of be right there with you. But these accounts of mindspeak are just too prevalent to ignore. I mean, you could write an entire book on Bigfoot mindspeak. So there seems to be some sort of consciousness component to this that we're not really addressing, I don't think.
Yeah, I think the frustrating part is, it doesn't happen in every encounter. If it happened on every encounter, it'd be a lot easier to come up with a conclusion. The problem with Sasquatch is every encounter is almost kind of different. They're the same, but they're different. in the sense of what happens. And, a lot of the Native Americans, they did talk about, don't look Bigfoot in the eyes because they'll hypnotize you. Some Native Americans will say, don't look him in the eyes because it makes them mad. But I have heard the hypnotize. I'll go ahead and solve this mystery right here, guys. It's infrasound. What's the next chapter we're going on?
Yeah, that really is the catch-all. And some of the people in the cryptozoological community who are often quick to say don't use one unexplained to explain another, will turn around and say it's all infrasound, and that's a compelling hypothesis, but don't just say infrasound and dust off your hands and walk away. Like, we've got to unpack that a bit for sure.
That's kind of like the sound version of saying like all this the glowing eye stuff is just eye shine. It's a really simple explanation that doesn't quite really explain it.
Yeah, and I want to get into that, Tim, the eye shine. I want to ask you guys, when you look into infrasound, there is some ways you could explain, that could have, we don't know if Bigfoot does infrasound or not, first of all, but you could kind of go, that might be infrasound, or it might, but there's a lot of things that happen in encounters that you can't explain away with infrasound. Infrasound doesn't affect someone the way they're talking about being affected, yet you're right, Josh, a lot of people pass it off and go, it's infrasound.
Yeah, I mean, you have people doing things, we talk about this a little bit more in Volume 1, but you have people doing things like having some sort of forced amnesia. Oh, it's infrasound. You have somebody not seeing the Bigfoot or suddenly forgetting to turn on their camera. Oh, it's infrasound. And, well, again, that might be a good answer in some of these cases. That's the exact same kind of stuff that you see crop up time and again in UFO reports. People have these exact same reactions to seeing a UFO. I don't know why I didn't take a camera. I had my camera on me. And that sort of gets into a little bit of the self-negation that Tim alluded to earlier in the trickster phenomena. Not to take us off into that tangent just yet, but
yeah, I mean, there's so much to it, Josh. There's so much to this to where we don't know. And I always hate, when people just, and I was one of them at one time where you try, the problem is you don't want to say, I don't know, because it's almost, I don't know what it is, if it's ego or anything else, but you don't want to say, I don't know. And at the end of the day, nobody knows anything. And it always cracks me up. You hear these researchers go, there's no experts in the Bigfoot world. And then they'll go on for the next 20 minutes telling you about them being an expert in the Bigfoot world. And it doesn't help, to just bypass this weird stuff, because it does go on. It actually goes on a lot, more than most people would think. The guy who sees a Sasquatch cross the road and he's out hunting and, it's a 3 or 4 second encounter. Nothing really weird happened except for seeing something that shouldn't exist. But people who have had other encounters with them, there's a lot of weird stuff that goes on.
Well, and again, a direct line that you can draw to people who see a craft in the sky and say, oh, it must be aliens. And the people who have abductions have a lot stranger metaphysical experiences, for sure.
The repeat encounter thing is incredibly important. And again, when I first got into this, I was fully in the flesh and blood camp. I honestly, I thought it must be a creature.
Yeah. Ditto. Yeah.
I'll figure it out. We'll solve this. In my lifetime, they'll catch one, and I really just don't have faith that that's going to happen. I don't think they probably can be caught, or if they do, they're caught and then they disappear real quick, which is the whole other chapter. But the amount of weird stuff. I mean. That's the thing I was told. Well, this weird stuff, it barely ever happens. It only happens in a rare amount of cases. Well, like Josh said, put these two books together, it's 600 some pages filled with weird stuff, and we weren't exhaustive. We didn't put everything down. We chose a few cases to illustrate each concept. There's a ton of it out there. There's a ton of this. There's no shortage of weird stuff with Bigfoot.
And again, we said it for the last time we were on here, but I think it bears repeating. Tim and I are pretty darn agnostic about what this is, beyond the fact that we are convinced that people are seeing something that is not conform to, the established reality that we all, exist in consensus. Beyond that, we're not saying that Bigfoot is a fairy or a ghost or an alien or, a witch or anything like that. But that there are these similarities to these different traditions that you can draw. And it seems like some of this evidence is genuinely anomalous and does bear out the fact that we're dealing with something that is stranger than just a flesh and blood creature.
Yeah, and that's the point I like that you just made, Josh, that you guys don't really go into it trying to sell, Zorth is our leader and we're the chosen ones explaining, what's going on in the Bigfoot world. You guys go, hey, this weird stuff's going on. Here's some examples. And, Josh has, and you too as well, Tim, both you guys understand folklore and you can kind of pull examples from the past. That's why it's so enjoyable to read. I wanted to ask you, plus on top of that, you guys are both fantastic writers, but Tim, let me ask you about the eyeshine. When I first started taking these eyeshine reports, I would go, well, they must be mistaken. It was all ego talking. And then once you put your ego aside and go, well, you weren't really there, and B, you're not really that smart, maybe shut your mouth and just listen. A lot of people will say it was an eyeshine, especially coming from hunters. They'll say it was not eyeshine, it was eye glow. And we have everything from red, blue eyes to, yellow, orange, different, which makes it even more weird. But there's a lot of those reports. Can you talk about the eyeshine section in the book?
Oh, yeah. I really got into it. It's really interesting because, again, when I first got into it, it was, you hear this tapetum lucidum. You hear, it's just eyeshine, it's reflection. And I make the difference in the book between eyeshine and eye glow. Eyeshine being reflection, eye glow being self-illuminated eyes. And so, eyeshine it sounds like a great explanation until you start digging into it and you realize that there's no higher order primates. So no great apes, for instance, no hominids have a tapetum lucidum, which is the reflective layer. So if you're driving down the road and you see your headlights hit a deer and the eyes shine back, that's eyeshine, and they have something called a tapetum lucidum. It's a reflective layer on the eyes that helps them gather, for nocturnal creatures, helps them gather a lot of light, but that will reflect in your beams. But no great apes have this. And in fact, only some like low order monkeys and the primates have it. I think like the lemurs might have it, and some lower order monkeys like that. So, but no great apes have it. So you have something in a tapetum lucidum, if that is what it is, and I don't think that's the case, that is unique to this. If it is a great ape or a relict hominid, it would be unique to it. It would have this unique thing that no other great apes or relict hominids have. Now, if we talk about self-illuminating eyes, which, like you said, I've talked to a number of witnesses who are adamant that it was not reflecting, it was illuminating. These lights were shining. These eyes were shining, rather. They were lit up. There was nothing to reflect, they'll say, or whatever. I think Cliff Barackman, on his website, he puts forth an explanation that has to do with red eye on cameras. And if you look at pictures, sometimes people's, with flash photography, people's eyes seem to light up in flash photography. And what that is, it's actually the flash reflecting on the back of your eyes. And that's why it'll come out red. That's why it's red eye. They're actually the I think it's the little blood vessels.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with the actual eyes. It's more the camera, right? Right, Tim?
Yeah. It's just the reflection off of your eyeball, essentially. Barackman was saying, like, well, maybe Bigfoot's eyes are so big that the pupils are always open and it's gathering all this light, and you're basically getting this red eye effect all the time. It's a very interesting explanation for red eye glow. It does not explain all of these other different colors, every color of the rainbow, and sometimes changing. I've taken, and I know you've had Jeremy from Texas on, he's been on my show too, where he talked about the changing lights in the eyes. He watched them go from red to blue to green. I forget the order, but they were just changing. He described them like Christmas lights. There's no natural creature that has anywhere in all of the earth that has glowing eyes. And if you think about glowing eyes, that really would mess up your night vision, at least the way we understand how vision works. So here we have something that's not only not in any ape, but not in any creature at all. So how does this thing, evolve this ability, and what is it used for? And the only thing I can do is go back and look in folklore. So while no animals have glowing eyes, if you look back through folklore, lots of these things like fairies and jinn and werewolves and vampires and all these different accounts of these supernatural creatures with glowing eyes. So, what does it mean? I don't know how does it work? I don't know, but I think it's very, very interesting that the only other place you get glowing eyes is in the accounts of these supernatural creatures.
I think what Cliff Brockman's doing is trying to explain, why an eyewitness would say the eyes were glowing. I understand where he's coming from. With regard to the eyes, it's weird. You do get red, blue, yellow, a multitude of colors of this eye glow that eyewitnesses report. And then every once in a while you'll get, I've probably had a couple of them where eyewitnesses will talk about their eyes changing color. It's very strange.
Yeah, like I said, Jeremy, he was on both our shows, he said they changed like Christmas lights. It's very bizarre, but once again, you can't take a witness and say, I'm going to believe him when he talks about this big hairy creature in the woods because I like the idea of big hairy creatures in the woods, and say, but he was crazy when he saw the eyes change colors. You can't do that. That's not intellectually honest. You have to take the witness report as they tell you. And if he says he saw a big hairy creature with eyes that changed, color, you got to go with what he says. At least I feel you do.
What about science, though? I'm just joking. No,
well, I mean that's a good point. But the people who say, well, what about science? I mean, you've got to look at. It's kind of a deficit, I think, in a lot of cryptozoologists' education, is that they've got to look at what's happening in psi research, and there are some really compelling people who are looking at psi research. University of Cornell professor Daryl Bem, Dean Radin. I mean, these people who are doing psychic research in laboratory settings and are getting statistically significant results. So, yeah, but science, yeah, sure, science is on our side eventually, right?
Well, it's fascinating. Most of the people who are in the Bigfoot world are Christians, and they go to church and they read their Bible. And you ask them, "Do you believe in demons?" And they'll go, "Absolutely." Well, on a scientific level, explain to me demonic possession. When a demon possesses a person, explain to me on a scientific level. Walk me through that. And they can't.
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard to, and I think that's the default of science and probably Western philosophy in general, that we've separated those two ideas so much. And I understand the value of it. I mean, there is a value, like, gravity works. If you drop an apple, it's going to fall. So there's certainly a value to applied science and experimental science, but there's something about these accounts with this weird stuff, Bigfoot among it, that has to do, I feel, with humanity. And when you bring in the witness, so science hates witnesses. Like you and I, Wes, we love witness accounts. I know that's, I'll listen to them all day. That's why I love Sasquatch Chronicles. I believe people. I honestly don't think people lie about this stuff. I don't think they have a reason to. But science in general does not like witness testimony. They'll say, well, people have, failed memories and they're just inconsistent and their memory is colored by this and that. And so science doesn't like it at all. So what we have in the end when it comes to Bigfoot or any of this stuff really, but let's talk about Bigfoot. What we have in terms of Bigfoot is the vast majority of stuff. We've got some casts and we've got some hair samples and some scat samples and stuff, but the vast majority of what we have is witness reports. And if we're going to throw those out the window, we don't have a lot left. And I certainly don't want to do that.
I couldn't agree more. It's frustrating. That's why I've backed away from most researchers because, like you said, Tim, it's not honest I'll paint the picture of an ape running through your yard, but if the ape says your name or if it seems to vanish, or I'm going to leave that part out, and it's very dishonest to do that. One of the things I want to ask you about, Josh, is this mindspeak. And I've been hearing it for a long time. And I think when you hear mindspeak from some of these in the Bigfoot world that are cult leaders, that they're the chosen one, it's easy to go, this guy's a flute player, this guy's nuts. I'm not, this guy's, now the Bigfoot are predicting if Trump's going to win or if Trump's coming back to office. And it's just like, but when you hear it from a hunter who goes, there's a weird part of this encounter I don't really want to talk about, but here's what happened. I heard, and it was like a weird voice in the back of my head saying something. Or like when I had Les Stroud on, I wasn't prepared for Les to tell me about his mindspeak incident.
Yeah.
But it does go on. This is another thing. Now, does it happen in every encounter? No. It's hard to measure this mindspeak, but it does go on. Talk a little bit about that, Josh. What's in the book, and what's your take on the mindspeak?
Well, we there are plenty of different cases of mindspeak. I think in the book we have like 10 or 15 that I just really did selectively from the 70s through the current era. Not all accounts are created equal, right? There are Bigfoot witnesses who should be believed, and there are Bigfoot witnesses who shouldn't be believed. And the similar situation is happening with mindspeak. I'm sure. I'm sure that some of these can be attributed to someone's inner monologue, and I think some of these are genuine. And it seems to be that whatever these other intelligences are that operate with us prefer most of the time to speak telepathically. I mean, it's a very, very common, I would say almost to an exclusive degree, trope that you'll find in a lot of alien abduction reports. Their mouths don't move. They speak to you telepathically. You could go one of two ways with this. You could go the route that I was sort of alluding to earlier about psi phenomena becoming more and more of an emergent reality that we're going to have to incorporate into our scientific method. Science has done great things. Let's not throw all that out. We just need to incorporate this extra perspective into it. So that could be a possibility. If we are dealing with some sort of flesh and blood creature, which seems less and less likely to me personally, it's entirely possible that they might have harnessed this ability as well. And then if you want to take a look at this from, a broader, more folkloric perspective, there is a very common theme that you'll find in a lot of world religions of, theophany, the idea that to behold or to interact with the divine somehow means that you'll be hurt or injured, or your human body just literally can't handle it. And I've wondered if, again, maybe a lot of these stories of theophany are really sort of a result of interfacing with these entities and being spoken to telepathically, because if they actually spoke to us, our bodies wouldn't be able to handle it. But you find a lot of these different mindspeak messages tend to sort of circle around the same things. Back up, no danger, don't shoot, don't take a photo of me, leave and you'll be okay, those sort of things. And then also something that you pointed out a while back on this show, that a lot of these messages also tend to have these sort of environmentalist messages, scolding us for not being good stewards of the environment, or even in some cases, sort of semi-apocalyptic messages, which completely dovetails with that alien contact experience, particularly the contactees of the 50s and 60s. So an idea that I've played with as well is that if Bigfoot does represent something more along the lines of a forest spirit, a guardian of the forest, a protector of the forest, then perhaps this is almost like them being sort of a missionary for animism, if you would say. So like a missionary for being more in touch with the earth, trying to encourage people to return to that sort of way of lifestyle that our ancestors once had. Possibly, or maybe none of that. I really don't know. But I think that to your point that you said earlier about believing witnesses and stuff. I mean, yeah, mindspeak is hard to swallow, but you can only walk back parts of people's stories so far until you end up saying, well, they just saw a bear, right? So, if somebody says that they saw something strange and it disappeared, you can't say, oh, well, it just must have, jumped into a ditch. No, if they say it's disappeared in front of their eyes, you've got to believe them. And I think that something similar is going on with mindspeak. We've really got to start to try and incorporate the odder aspects of the phenomena, or else we're going to keep on treading water like we have for, 50, 60, 70 years.
Yeah, and that's what I like about the book. I like the fact that you guys don't try and sell people on this is why this is happening. You guys don't really give answers, but you give a lot of modern day examples of really weird situations people are in. And then you kind of give a historical lesson on these same type of situations that we're seeing today. That's what I really like about the book. Tim, I want to ask you about gifting. When I had the two brothers on, and I often think about gifting in this sense. And for the audience, people will have gifting stumps where they'll leave something for their creature, and then the creature will leave something for them. It'll take it and then leave something for them. In a lot of these situations, like the two brothers, where they had the spirit medium lady come out, a woman in white, there's a lot to this encounter. But anyway, they were trying to trap these creatures with pictures, and they were doing it through gifting. And she was saying, don't take anything from them. Don't give them anything. You're not feeding a wild animal like leaving apples or that sort of thing. They see it as a tribute. That's why they get so upset when you stop. It's not that you're feeding a wild animal. It's the fact that it's a form of tribute, which is kind of a weird way to look at it. And I know you guys go into gifting in the book. Tim, tell us a little bit about what's in the book regarding gifting.
Yeah, I covered that a little bit more in the first book, but I'm happy to talk about it. It's so interesting to me. The thing about gifting is it really overlays really nicely with spirit gifting. And, it's interesting that you said that psychic said that to the two brothers. I had a Franciscan monk that comes on Strange Familiars periodically, Brother Richard, and I asked him about it, and he said, don't ever ask for anything, and anything you're given is not to keep. He said you always want to re-gift it. So he was very specific about that, which again, this, if you look back into folklore, and he said too, like he was not, he's very accepting of folklore. And he said, yeah, pay attention to the rules laid out in folklore. And if you look in folklore, there's pretty specific rules where they tell you basically, you don't ask for things. My goodness, if you do ask for something and it's given to you, you better take it, because bad stuff's going to happen if you don't. But you do, in general, you don't ask for things. Stay away from food, because if you start leaving food, and I mean, how many Bigfoot examples is this? People start leaving food, then they stop, and it goes crazy. Well, that's all over folklore. People will start leaving, beer out for a brownie or something like this, and they'll stop, and then the brownie will kill their livestock or mess their house up or whatever the case is.
What's a brownie?
Brownie's like a small hairy creature,
Oh, I gotcha.
Yeah, it's a fairy, kind of a fairy creature, but analogous to like a little person.
If you read stories of brownies, they sound just like a Littlefoot description, to the extent that they like live in barns and they, do all the similar things. But it's one of a couple of different fairy analogs. Yeah, just a little short monkey-faced fairy.
Yeah, with red glowing eyes,
and hairy body. Yeah,
nothing to see here. But yeah, so there's examples all over folklore of people they stop this gifting and the creatures go crazy. And again, when I got into this, I heard these Bigfoot gifting horror stories, and people kind of said that Bigfoot grows accustomed to the calories. Well, if you think of a creature that big, and you think of a couple candy bars people leaving on a tree stump, you're not going to impact this creature's caloric needs with a candy bar or two. You have to be bringing it wheelbarrows full of food to impact its caloric intake. This something that big would have to be eating constantly, especially if it doesn't cook its meat. It would need to be eating just everything it could all day long. Mountain gorillas, if they had brains the size of humans, they wouldn't have enough time in the day to feed themselves to power their brain. Brains take a lot of calories. So presumably Bigfoot's a big brain creature and needs a lot of calories. So a couple, candy bars on a tree stump, they cannot affect this thing's caloric needs at all. I just refuse to believe that. But when you look at these folklore cases, boy, they just line up perfectly with these Bigfoot cases. The other idea, and I'm sure you've heard this, Wes, is the idea of the Bigfoot Garden, where people tell you to plant a separate garden away from your own.
Yeah.
Well, what is that but an offering area? You've now created a specific area that's an offering to these creatures. Any natural animal doesn't care about a separate garden. It's going to look at that garden and your garden and say, oh boy, now I have two places to take food from. But yet people report that if you make this garden, that these creatures will somehow, respect it, and they'll know that it's for them, and they won't take food from your garden. Well, that's not a natural animal behavior. That's something else. In my opinion, it is anyway. That's something vastly intelligent and weird.
It's intention-based behavior. Right?
Yes.
So,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, intention has a lot to do with it. If I heard one podcast where they were talking about, and they said that, well, it doesn't count if Bigfoot's eating food from your trash can. Well, how does Bigfoot know if your trash can isn't some kind of fancy offering thing? And how does a Bigfoot know that you don't just discard your trash on a tree stump if you're leaving your offerings there? It wouldn't know. There's no way it would know. So it has to do with intention, and when you leave out these offerings, it's an intention-based thing. And in general, I've heard a number of stories, and I myself have had some success with it. So I'm a little bit of a hypocrite when I tell people not to do it, but I would suggest not doing it. It's very appealing because it does get results, but it's a funny game, and I don't know that we can look at the quote unquote rules in folklore, but I don't know if we understand all the rules. And the other side has their own rules maybe.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought that up, Tim. The whole garden situation. I've had a lot of eyewitnesses. They'll say, well, it was tearing apart my garden, so I planted a separate garden just for the Sasquatch, and they leave my garden alone, which is really weird when you think about it. Any normal, let's say some sort of primate, how would a natural animal know, oh, this is my area and that's your area, and I'll leave it alone? I'm really glad you brought that up. And the name of the book, again, for the audience is Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, Volume 2, Evidence. And I want to ask you real quick, Josh, regarding, normally I ask people, what do you think Sasquatch is? But, after reading a portion of this book, and I will finish reading it, I read the first one, loved it. You go into Trackcast, Trackways, vocals, Sasquatch seeming to disappear, this weird eye glow. And normally I ask people, what do you think Sasquatch is? But what do you think is actually going on here? Because as encounters seem to come in more and more, it seems to be ramping up, in my opinion. And I'm just curious, what do you think is actually going on here?
I'm of a couple of different mindsets. I mean, I think that the Bigfoot as an image is at a level of popularity that I would sort of compare to like the gray alien during the 90s. You could turn everywhere and see the gray alien and, Roswell and all this stuff. And sometimes I wonder if there isn't something to that forest guardian idea that, as we continue to just wreck the planet and, be reckless, that there isn't something about this sort of archetype emerging. Accordingly, because I can't go outside without seeing at least one Bigfoot shirt or Bigfoot bumper sticker or something, and that's down here in Georgia. To say nothing of where you are. As far as what an archetype is, the source code of the universe, I think is probably one of the simplest ways to put it. That was sort of my attitude after compiling Where the Footprints End Volume 2, but I'm working on another project now that's sort of making me rethink that and thinking that maybe Bigfoot, like a lot of the paranormal, really is tied into these transitional states, specifically, the transition from life into death. I think it maybe has something to do with that in a roundabout sort of way. But, to keep things simple, I'll settle on wild man archetype, which, means that we have this need as human beings to interface with this half man, half animal thing, and there is some other intelligence. Don't know what it is. Maybe it's demons, maybe it's fairies, maybe it's, the Jungian collective unconscious. I don't know. But there is some sort of other intelligence outside of us, or maybe within us, but probably outside of us, that chooses that image to interact with us. For what reason? I don't know. But that's sort of where I was at the end of these books.
Yeah, so when we talk about this stuff, and you'll hear me use words like apparitional and archetype and stuff. And the problem with that is I think in a lot of people's mind, that's a very ephemeral thing. And they think I'm saying they're not real. And I want to be very, very clear. I've talked to tons of witnesses. I've listened to tons of Sasquatch Chronicles and your witnesses. I believe witnesses. They are seeing something that's very, very real. It's here. It leaves footprints. It leaves hair. It leaves scat. It can leave blood when it's shot. It's something that is very real. So when I say something that's apparitional, or an archetype, I don't want people to think I'm saying it's an illusion. It's not. It's real. It's here. I don't know the rules. I don't know quite how it works. Like Josh said, the wild man archetype is kind of like our go-to thing. It's not really quite an explanation because it's sort of like a term that just kind of hangs in the air. It's like saying it's interdimensional. What does that mean? We don't really know. We can't go between dimensions ourselves, so we don't really quite understand what that means. I'll say, like, wild man archetype, I agree with Josh. It has something to do with this thing. People have reported this throughout history, and we've not caught one. But I don't want people to think I'm saying it's not real in some way. I really believe it's real. When people see it, it's here, it's physical. I just don't know that it always is in the same way that we are. And I know that's kind of a confusing answer, but that's the best I can do.
Yeah, co-signed.
So you guys are saying you guys think it's a great ape we haven't caught up with then?
Exactly. It's problem solved.
You know what? Maybe. I'm still got some room for that in my worldview.
Yeah, that's what I'd like it to be. I really would like it to be that. Nothing more would make me more happy than if it came out and it was just some primate we haven't caught up with. But then how do you explain all this other weird stuff? And that's why I like the book, that you guys go into the book with all the different weird stuff. And I like that, like I said before throughout the show, you guys don't really try and sell anyone on, if it's red eyes, they're mad. If it's blue eyes, they're happy. If it's orange eyes, they're, you guys don't do that. You guys just kind of give examples of throughout history of different eye shine and even also some of the different vocals. And it's pretty eye-opening. I hope people go out and get the book, Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness, and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, Volume 2, Evidence. Check out Tim's podcast, Timothy Renner, Strange Familiars. Very cool podcast. I listen every week. Tim, congratulations on hitting over 200 episodes. I forgot to congratulate you on, I know you're well over 200 now, but it's a huge milestone, and congrats on that, man.
Oh, thanks, Wes. I did want to mention one more thing. I didn't get a chance to pop on and talk about my art book. So just real quick, if I can mention.
Yeah, absolutely.
If people like my illustrations, I have a whole book of my black and white pen and ink illustrations. It's called Apparitions, Illustrations of the Other. You were going to have me on, and I got really busy doing this second Where the Footprints End book, so I didn't get a chance to pop on. But that's not on Amazon. So people, if you want that, you have to get it directly from me. And all my contact information is at strangefamiliars.com. So all that goes to me.
Cool. And I'll throw up a link. Josh, thanks for coming on, man. It was a pleasure talking with you again.
Likewise. This is one of the last podcasts that I was a listener to that I ever got to talk on earlier this year. So to be back is a real treat for me. So thanks, Wes.
Yeah, it was a pleasure having you on, Josh. Thanks again. And definitely check out Tim. His podcast is Strange Familiars. Go to strangefamiliars.com. Thanks so much, guys, for taking the time to come on. And that's it for tonight, everyone. Remember, if you've had an encounter, shoot me an email. My email address is wes@sasquatchchronicles.com. If you want to get additional shows, check out sasquatchchronicles.com and become a member. Until next time, everyone.
About limitless infinite life. She is my thunder. No wonder I'm going under the intoxicating danger I like. Save me from myself, let me drown in my black lake. Let me float away. Save me from myself, let me drown in my black lake. Beauty is a black lake, let me sail away. An epiphany, bring the shore to life. Save me from myself, let me drown